I've said it's a pleasure to welcome Glenna Smith. We're going to talk about the long view of financial crime and regulatory compliance. It's appropriate because at the June 2024, 2 months ago, last month, the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, announced in its plenary session that they were preparing for the next round of mutual evaluations, which are carried out by the regional bodies under the FATF methodology. And the other thing FATF said they wanted to do was strengthen anti-money laundering and countering finance terrorism, strengthen expertise at the regional level. And just looking down at the attendees, I can see people that I recognise from various parts of the world. So our webinar today will actually contribute to FATF's spreading the good word regionally and spreading expertise. Glenna has over 30 years of regulatory compliance and financial services experience. And having set the scene, there we are. And yes, she looks very much like her photo. Hopefully there's no photo of me, because I probably don't look like my photo and you wonder if I'm an avatar or something created by artificial intelligence. We're going to be in the conversation with Glenna, picking up on various things. But as I say, the theme is the evolution over time and the need for continuous awareness and learning. Just as FATF has announced in June their forthcoming round of mutual evaluations, and also their ambition that expertise grows, there's always something that's changing, and learning lifelong for individuals and for organisations becomes essential in order to be up to date, up to speed with what's happening. I'll let Glenna add anything if she wants to the biopic which is on there, and then after that we'll get on with the conversation. Glenna, hello. Anything more you want to add to the biopic as it says there? Meet the specialist.
Thank you, Stephen. So happy to be here with you today. For those of you attending, wherever you are in the world, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. You know, it's quite an interesting feat that I've accomplished here, Stephen, because I have 36 years of experience in the broader financial services sector, and yet I'm only 29 years old. So, you know, some of the learning has been double time. So I share that to say that I've been in this field, this sector for many years, and specifically just in regulatory compliance for over 25 years. So there's a lot for us to discuss today, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Great. I also am only 21 because my birthday is every leap year. Well, it's not actually. Great. Thanks for that. The themes that we're going to talk about are the long view. There's a famous phrase, take the long view to see how things have developed over time and how we might learn from it. There's a famous saying also that organizations who don't pay attention to history often are doomed to repeat the mistakes or the failures of history. So you've said a little bit about your 36 years yourself, Glenna, experience in it. How did you become involved in compliance as a field?
Well, it's quite interesting, Stephen. I was already working in banking and working in various roles within it, operations, commercial lending, risk and profitability analyst, trading, all kinds of fun positions. And it's actually because of the evolution of regulatory compliance, regulatory frameworks for countries, new risks that need addressing by countries, that there was a realization within banks that we need to start this thing called the compliance department. Before I started one at one of the banks, really and truly, the limited regulatory requirements that existed up till then were often handled by somebody in the finance department that was filing, you know, special filing requests with the regulator of a financial nature, things like prudential, reports, maybe credit risk management, market exposures and so on. And then what other little bits there were, it was often handled by the legal department. And the reason that I got the tap on the shoulder to launch a new compliance division within a bank and contribute to that and actually start up operational risk team as well is because there had been so many changes in a short amount of time. And it's really interesting to me because if I think back, and I can't even name them all right now, but I'd definitely be happy to share a few of them. In just the last 25 years, the way that the regulatory landscape has changed within financial services, and I mean that as a broad field, is quite tremendous. And the most interesting question I think we have to ask ourselves first is, where are we expected to get the appropriate persons and skill sets to address each of these, especially when someone in government launches some new area of focus or is trying to prevent some risk exposure? We find ourselves almost in a catch-up position where we need to put together a team, we need to put together a program, we need to resource it, and we also need to figure out how to get the appropriate skill set for those persons involved. So if I may, I wouldn't mind sharing just a few examples. And by way of these examples, we'll see how great the need is and how diverse it is. So if I think back to some of the big ones in the last 25 years, and I won't cover all of them, I'm sure people would be happy to share some others in the chat group that were important changes and turns for you as well. Going back about 25 years ago in Canada, for the first time we had, personal privacy legislation. Later, of course, we've seen in Europe and other places things like GDPR that added on to that. We've seen the OECD with their harmful tax practices and trying to crack down on what they consider to be tax havens or tax structures that are maybe too beneficial for some organizations and cause base erosion, profit sharing splits that go to certain nations instead of the nation where the activity took place. Then we've got the US who launched FATCA. And that was to address tax evasion by US taxpayers who maybe had holdings, assets, or investments in another country that the US government wouldn't have been aware of. And of course, from FATCA, then we have the spinoff of common reporting standards where all the countries said, well, gosh, I really wouldn't mind receiving a report of all of my citizen taxpayers that have any assets or holdings in another country. More recently, we have things like economic substance, where countries need to prove that the companies that they have registered in their jurisdiction are actually doing businesses of substance, so that we're not going to have things like, and trying to crack down on things like shell companies. Now, if we go back again to the 25 years in Canada, the same year that new privacy legislation and regime was launched, and you had to have a privacy officer, you had to have policies, you had to have training. In the space of anti-money laundering, for the first time, money laundering came with obligations to have a compliance officer, to have training, and to have required, obligatory suspicious transaction reporting. So imagine now you're a bank and suddenly you need to set up a privacy department and an anti-money laundering department basically at the same time. And so that is what we did. And of course, following on from money laundering that we got through the FATF's 40 recommendations, then we had 9/11. And I was an anti-money laundering officer and compliance officer before 9/11 happened. So interestingly enough, I was involved with some law enforcement at all kinds of high levels where we were trying to crack the case on 9/11. Like, how do we operationalize this? We started to get some very initial first drafts of lists of names of persons who could be suspected terrorists. They were so basic, they were so vague, quite frankly, they weren't manageable and they weren't helpful. So one example is, I can remember, I'm just sharing a story here, getting one of the first lists, and we had to try to scrub our portfolio and report to authorities, freeze any assets or accounts and report to authorities if we had those persons. And I was working at a large bank. One of the names on the list, a common name, Muhammad Ali. I do the search in our bank's database, thousands of hits. On the list from law enforcement, no other details, not a place of birth, not an age, not a date of birth, no other identifying information. So I called the person that was on the list that was handling this through the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and I said, listen, let's have an open discussion here. What do you want me to do with this? I'm not freezing thousands of accounts because this person holds this name. For these lists to be effective, we as the financial institutions, we're going to need more information. We can't take the risk of freezing accounts for persons where that is not the person involved. We then would possibly create an exposure to ourselves of legal risks by blocking those persons from their financial accounts and activities. So, you know, all of these things have to be sorted out as we go. And then, of course, if we're sticking to the FATF with their money laundering, counter-financing of terrorism requirements, and then, of course, we have proliferation financing in more recent years where we're trying to look for and stop the funding of things like weapons of mass destruction. All three of those alone, money laundering, financing of terrorism, proliferation financing, they come with their own complexities, and they were all introduced at different times, and they all required some level of knowledge, some level of specialization and understanding. Now let's flip the switch, and this isn't a new thing, but of course, thanks to the pandemic, it's really come to light. Look at all the cybersecurity crimes, problems, hacking, invasions, ransomware demands, leaks that we're seeing of company data and information being exposed through the media. And that's all necessitating data protection. Now, where are you going to get someone who's a privacy expert, a taxation expert for FATCA, a terrorist financing expert, and a cybersecurity expert? It's really quite a feat, Stephen, for financial institutions and any others that have to follow all these regulatory compliance requirements to come up with the persons, find the resources to staff those teams, and then get all of your different specialists. And the only way you can do that right in line with what your theme is, it's continuous learning, it's awareness, it's knowledge. And there's many, many sources that we can talk about for gaining that information in a little bit.
Great. That's a great introduction as to events that have happened globally that lead to the need to understand who's doing what and who might be genuinely suspicious and who just happen to be caught by a common name. My name's Stephen Jones. In the university, there are 4 or 5 people called Stephen Jones. So my full name is Stephen John Jones, which helps me stand out a bit. But you talked about the compliance function, the need to create a compliance function rather than just have it scattered around in financial institutions. One of the challenges that's often leveled at financial institutions is the compliance function is to try and keep the organization's name, reputation nice and clean, out of the headlines. Very rarely manage to do it even for very large providers who shall remain nameless. But of course, there's a tension in there. You talked also about culture, and the boards of directors of financial institutions will on the one hand be saying to the compliance function, keep our name out of the headlines and clean, and to another part of the organization, hey, we need growth and we need profits and things like that. How can that tension, as it's often described, how can that tension be resolved, do you think?
Well, Stephen, it's a fantastic question, and I'm not sure if I could go to the level of using a word as strong as resolved.
No,
in some senses, I wonder if a little bit of tension is good. It almost keeps both sides on their toes. Compliance can right?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Compliance is not there to stop business. Compliance is there to find an answer and a way to yes. Maybe not in the initial way thought, if it's risky, if it's completely offside of requirements and so on. But I think if you have really good compliance persons, they will roll up their sleeves. They will understand the operations of the business. They will understand the products and services, what the intentions are, and working together, the compliance persons can then, better inform and educate those in various business departments, marketing, business development, and so on. And let's sit down together. You're telling me what you want to accomplish in terms of sales and business growth. I'm telling you where some of our guardrails are in terms of the realities of our compliance and regulatory framework as a company and as a country. Let's figure out where we can find the sweet spots where we can manage to both. And so I think tension in a good way, tension in terms of each person trying to achieve their objective, can work together pretty well. Now, of course, what I should start by saying is, first of all, every organization has its culture. I've worked at a lot of different organizations. They all had a very different and very unique culture. And it's a matter of figuring that out and managing to that. And even though there is a term that I'm sure everybody on here knows about, and somebody is probably already groaning to themselves saying, oh my God, Glenna, don't say it, don't say it. But it is the reality. The tone comes from the top. If you have a board of directors who is very aggressive and not that on side of compliance requirements, that culture will probably permeate through your senior management team, down to the managers, down to the supervisors, and it could make things difficult to manage from a compliance perspective. However, if the tone from the top is one of, yes, we need to grow business, but a very conservative approach when it comes to meeting our regulatory compliance requirements, protecting maybe a very well-established brand, and not incurring undue reputational risk as well as regulatory risks and legal risks, then you may have more support in that area. And, the compliance persons, as funny as it sounds, the compliance officer especially, who is meant to be independent from the business and report only to the board, not to senior management, they may need to make sure that they have enough, authority, a loud enough voice in a good way, and some gravitas to be able to stand up and have the discussions with the board and tell them where maybe they need them to get on board a little bit more. And the compliance person could work with the board or the corporate secretary of the board and help them figure out what is the risk appetite and tolerance of the business, because that's going to guide and kind of lay out the flavor for what is going to happen internally. Now, I'll give you an example, because like I say, I worked at a lot of different organizations, some where things were very conservative at the top and some where things were very aggressive at the top. And I can remember years ago, an executive that came and worked from our global head office, but was based for a few years in the Canadian head office. When I was hired to be the compliance officer in that department, he had a private meeting with me. And he was a very direct person. And he said, look, if you've come to work to find friends, you're in the wrong place. I want you to be the compliance officer. If you want somebody to like you, go get a dog. You're here to keep me out of jail.
Okay, I'm not suddenly going to start barking like a dog, but that's the case. I mean, in some cultures, you can't please all people all the time, but equally, if your ambition is to be friends with everyone, you're likely to run into challenges. Let me pick up on something that I don't disagree that some degree of tension is good, keeps people on their toes, etc. But the sheer volume of potential transactions these days is a major problem. And each time there's a revision that says, well, look at this and look at that. Part of the problem, of course, is very few banks, if any, are able to have representation that they fully control themselves as a subsidiary in every jurisdiction. So you end up having respondent relationships. And one of the challenges there is to make sure that the partner that you have has as strict or whatever the word appropriately is, has the same level of appreciation of the need for compliance, because something that goes wrong in country X through your partner invariably comes back to haunt you. Let me ask about the information overload and the potential for technology perhaps to solve some of these problems, given that technology doesn't care whether it has a friend or not. It just says this transaction's unusual for this customer. We've never seen them transact at this volume in this part of the world with that customer, or whatever it is. What's the role of technology, do you think, in compliance?
I think there is a great role for technology in several areas, and it is actually almost changing on a continuous basis, on a daily basis as we speak. So if I go back a number of years, when I first launched an AML investigation team at a bank, when it became a requirement to report on suspicious transactions, we didn't have something like a suspicious transaction monitoring automated system from some software vendor, as there are now copious offerings out there on the marketplace, lots of phenomenal products that could be investigated to see what's going to suit your business. We had to start off manually. I had to sort of get creative and inventive, think of scenarios, meet with the team that managed data, and start to put rules in place and ask them to run me certain reports on a monthly basis. You know, transactions over this amount, transactions with help with the fraud team in different, what they call the geovariants, you know, different locations, all kinds of things. Now, with the advent of technology, and this is over the past 20 years, things like suspicious transaction monitoring systems and software systems can be really fantastic at trying to take copious amounts of transactions and data, boil it down, and reduce it to certain alerts that are to be worked by an internal investigations team. Some banks are so large, they have what they call their own financial intelligence unit, whereby they are doing, you know, investigations of transactions and working alerts on a continuous basis to try to keep up with all the transactions. So I think in that case, technology, you know, I think for very large institutions, I can't see how they could possibly get away with not leveraging an enormous potential for various technology uses. Now that's on a transactional level. And the interesting and good thing is some of that in a different form has existed for decades when we think about managing fraud. And if I think back to some of the banks I worked at where we had very significant credit card portfolios, the fraud systems were phenomenal. And so I think to some extent, some of those technologies probably built off of how fraud systems work to provide alerts, but for suspicious transaction reasons, not just for protecting the institution from getting hit with a fraud loss. Now, on the other side of it, and there's many, but one other side of it, completely different, not to do with transactions at all. To your first point, Stephen, where you said there are so many changes, there's new legislation, there's new guidance papers, FATF might change the 40 recommendations, the regulations in whichever country you're sitting in today might change tomorrow, the guidelines might change, whatever the requirements, maybe your internal policies change. How do we possibly keep up with all that and manage that? Well, you could build your own internal system, but there are some systems, again, from software providers that are called things like legislative compliance management systems, where they load up all of the regulatory requirements for each particular country and jurisdiction into a system, and the compliance persons, along with a designated appointed person that is accountable and responsible for those areas, then get tagged with every single line item. And there's information that you have to upload. There's an attestation for whether you're in compliance with that area. Is there any opportunities for improvement or deficiencies that are identified? And then from there, you can almost create a little bit of a project list for, do we accept that as it is, or do we need to mitigate that, which means we need to put a remediation plan in place. And some of them, large institutions, might run an exercise like that on an annual basis and come up with a report that not only goes to the board, but in some cases, some regulators want to see that there's been an annual attestation that you're in compliance with all of your regulatory requirements. And for some institutions, that could be 1,000 line items. If you break down every single piece of legislation, regulation, guideline, and so on. So the reality is that's cumbersome, and quite frankly, it's tedious. But if we use technology, we can make our lives better and perhaps even reduce the opportunity for human error in some cases in case something was missed. So those are just a couple of examples.
Okay, let me pick up on thanks for that. Let me pick up on this idea of human error. Of course, software is written at the moment, although artificial intelligence is coming over my shoulder to write all sorts of things. But software is written by humans who intentionally or unintentionally introduce biases. You can have those checked out by other members of the team, of course. But you said when you were talking about your experience historically that you got in touch with one of the regulators and said, we've got this, I think it was Muhammad Ali was the name that you said, as an example, and we don't want to turn away bona fide customers, but we want to make sure we try and catch the ones that are have bad intents, etc. To what extent, when we talk about human error, is the chance for over-reporting of potential suspicious activities, because the technology just goes, this looks suspicious, and then they pass it elsewhere in the organization or outside to the enforcement. I'm minded by the fact that just over a year ago in 2023, FATF said we encourage organizations to adopt software and things, but at the same time, we still see a role for the human contribution in looking at some of these and interpreting them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So I believe the software systems, first of all, if you're buying it from a vendor, it's your duty to kick the tires, check it, ask the tough questions, test it, make sure that it's working for you, because at the end of the day, your organization still retains the ultimate accountability. You can't turn around and say, well, the software didn't catch it. That's not an excuse. So let's get that out of the way. Now, what happens is a lot of times, if we're talking about something like helping us with suspicious transaction reporting, and it kicks out these alerts as we talked about earlier, now you need a human person. As far as I'm concerned, the benefit would be to have a human person now working those alerts and reducing them. They will either dismiss them because, the technology didn't understand something, or, they were able to, with other investigations, come up with a reasonable explanation for that, why that was happening, or they do escalate it on for potential reporting. I still think, and I can't really picture right now a world where we would be able to yet trust, whether it's, an automated system or the use of AI to do our suspicious transaction reporting, sifting through the transactions, and let it report to authorities and have no human person looking at it. I still think that we will elevate the quality if you have a human person then using their judgment, their discernment, and reasonable things that we might just understand in society to make a better decision at the end of the day. However, what it does is it takes that humongous volume, funnels it down into hopefully a workable volume of alerts that then get worked by your resources. Now you've got to make sure that you have enough resources to meet the funnel and not the other way around. You don't make sure the funnel gives you a narrow output because you've only got 10 persons. You can't do it that way. And there are some financial institutions that have gotten in trouble for doing that. So I think the human touch is always going to be there. There's going to be things that only you and I are going to understand that maybe we haven't yet been able to teach software or artificial intelligence to do for us.
That's right, and that's a great point for me. We're not coming to the end of our conversation just yet, but thank goodness people are in agreement, including Financial Action Task Force. There's still a role for humans, so there's a need for people to train people and continuous learning in this field. We're not just training AI at the moment. Let me just say in passing at this point, if people have comments that they want to make, questions that they want to ask, don't disrupt the flow. Type it up in the chat. When we come in a few minutes to having a question and answer, I'll moderate that session by looking to see what questions have been asked in the chat area, or you may at that point unmute yourself. But for now, as questions occur to you or comments, you could type them in the chat area. You said a little earlier, Glenna, about leadership. Any organisation, no matter what it be, financial institution, government, whatever, is only as good as its leadership and the message or the direction that they send it on. And we've talked about this tension and saying, well, tension's not necessarily a bad thing. Of course, much of the continuous learning is for tiers in an organization below the leaders. And is there a challenge in trying to, in inverted commas, educate the leaders, or is it sufficient that they see their competitors occasionally getting very negative headlines? How do we create the message correct from the top? Is it purely just a level of fines that will get their attention, or what?
You know, I dare say that I think in a lot of cases it could potentially be, and I don't want to speak for all the institutions, so I'm just going to throw out some possibilities and theories out there. I think a lot of times it's going to boil down to institution by institution, because again, part of that is the tone from the top. If the leader at the top and the boards at the top are, how do I say it, keeping everyone's feet to the fire in terms of making sure they have a level of knowledge, awareness, even that they can ask their senior management teams pointed questions and look for them to be able to answer compliance or risk management related questions and not have to call up their compliance officer to get the answer. It all depends. So there's some organizations where the leadership team is absolutely phenomenal at staying fully engaged, informed, awareness, even attending some events and so on, to have their level of knowledge being topped because they're taking risk management so seriously. And there's others that might need some encouragement.
Yeah, but I think we all merit encouragement. But in talking about the tone from the top and the senior management, I'm reminded of a bank which will remain nameless that was in. It happened to be in Silicon Valley, and it focused on one particular segment, the high-tech segment and things. And I seem to recall reading that when it needed to be rescued, because it was in financial difficulties, you talked about compliance and risk management. And I seem to recall reading somewhere that in the management team at the top, they had a vacancy for risk management for months and months and months. You know, I think something like that is quite negligent. We've been talking about regulations changing. We've been talking about the task of creating and sometimes demonstrating not only to the board of directors but also the national regulator that you have these systems that recognize all these different aspects of regulatory requirements. Of course, one individual or one stakeholder we haven't spoken about but is the cause of all of this is the criminal fraternity and the criminal element. And things like technology are very good at monitoring transactions that are within the global financial system, starting perhaps with SWIFT exchanges and things and messages. What about the likes of transnational organized criminal gangs, who of course are very nimble? They don't have to comply with regulations, and as soon as something changes, they found a way around it, etc. And many of their transactions can be in shadow banking, where we don't actually have a chance to catch them. Do we just have to go, okay, we just accept that will happen? Or are there any avenues that we might try and close that down?
Great question, Stephen. And I think if I may, I might even take something a little bit a step back from that. So transnational organized crime is a huge problem. There's no question about it. And that's part of what the FATF is looking to solve, whereby we have principles and standards by way of the FATF 40 recommendations trying to guide countries around the world, because there has been a knowledge by the G7 countries and other nations when FATF was established back in 1989 that there is a lot of transnational organized crime, and that makes it a lot more difficult when there are various countries involved. It adds to complexities, but to your point, there is going to be a movement of monies. And then I would say one thing we can't ignore when it comes to criminals, the creative things that they are up to. Criminals are always watching for opportunities to grow their business, shall we say. And an unfortunate reality that a lot of criminal organizations, including transnational organized criminal organizations, are going to be looking for is they watch for world events, I'll call them. Those can be wars, it could be 9/11, it could be a natural disaster, it could be the pandemic. And they rub their hot little hands together and they say, how can we exploit? Exactly. Thank you for the perfect demo. How can we exploit this? How can we turn this around to our advantage? How can we take advantage of the chaos? And sometimes it's a short window of chaos, but they will get in there, grab it, attention is elsewhere. What can we do? How can we exploit this? So that's a reality with criminal groups, whether they're transnational or they're more localized organized crime groups, and even smaller criminals that are just looking to get their foot in the door and exploit those situations. So to your comment about shadow banking, it is very difficult. The reality is for centuries, there have been various forms of ways of settling payments in various societies around the world. There are some old traditional ways of settling, financial accounts, if you will, across some societies that still exist today that are not within the modern financial institution and international financial system. So those do present realities in the world. The chances that we can probably see and monitor all of it, while a lofty ambition, and of course what we are aiming to do generally speaking, may or may not be reality. However, sometimes those shadow banking situations do at some point touch the traditional financial system. So we've still got entrances and exits. So those need to be watched, those need to be understood, those need to be observed for abnormalities and any deviations in transactions, just like anything else.
That's right. I'm minded by the fact that about this time last year, the Singapore authorities, much to their surprise, and the whole of Singapore society, detected a multi-billion-dollar money laundering arrangement in a society which is highly regulated itself, let alone the financial services industry. And just to pick up on your point about they eventually make it into the legal system, the money was laundered and then transferred into things that look legitimate, very high value properties, luxury goods, etc., etc. So there's always a way of getting things into the legitimate economy from the illicit. Just to close our conversation, and then I encourage, I see Mohammed Farmer's put a question in. We'll come to that in a moment. In your biopic, you talked about having looked at managing virtual currencies and risks. When we talk about even the smallest criminal, what might the potential be, do you think, for things like analyzing the blockchain, as a way to try and understand some of these things, rather than just looking at one transaction and saying out of a pool, this is unusual? Does blockchain as an approach offer us anything?
It absolutely does. And, there's more I would love to talk about if we have time in a moment about, continuous learning awareness. What can people do to take responsibility and ownership of their own learning journey, and where some of those avenues can come from? Because it's, it doesn't have to just be traditional learning. There's all kinds of opportunities for people to make it happen themselves. So Speaking of blockchain, speaking of virtual currency, digital assets, and so on, with any new products, services, and technologies, it brings a renewed necessity for us as compliance professionals to expand our horizons, expand our knowledge base, go deeper on a certain area, and sharpen our skill set. So over the last several years, I've taken a couple of certifications, one being the Chainalysis Fundamentals in Cryptocurrency course, which is phenomenally interesting. Yes, it was a time commitment. Yes, there was a financial component to it, but well worth the exploration. And if I was to work more in investigations, they have other courses where you're getting down to, just them as an example. There's many, many other fantastic ones out there where they have a reactor tool where, Stephen, if you were an investigator, I think it could be so exciting in these days where they have a reactor tool whereby you can actually do some investigations, come up with charts, and it looks almost like spider webs and connections where this wallet is connected to that one. It went through this exchange, it went here, disappeared from here, and so on. I think we need to make sure that we have some level of awareness. So depending on where you're working, what your exposure is going to be to it, you owe it to yourselves to obtain that information. Do not sit there waiting at your desk at work for somebody to come and take your hand, lead you across the room, and sign you up for a course. There's so much information you can get yourself. So with things like cryptocurrency, there's a lot to learn. With blockchain, there's a lot to learn. There's things that will be on the blockchain, won't be on the blockchain. You need to learn the differences. What does it look like? You can go on Blockchain Explorer. You can type in, numbers for transactions and then see where it came from, where it went to, and you can really dive deep into a rabbit hole. And it can be a phenomenally interesting experience. There's another fantastic company called TRM, and they help a lot of law enforcement. They've helped out the IRS and many others in uncovering where some nefarious groups have moved criminal funds around and help them track and trace that. So I think it's very interesting. I think with any product or services or, something that is a store or a transfer of value, just as we're going to explore it for interesting uses as a consumer, the criminals are going to explore it as well. If we think back to when credit cards came out, what happened? The fraudsters tested it to see how they could abuse it. When I can remember, I'm dating myself, when ATM machines came out in a retail bank branch, what happened? Criminals went, figured out if I put in an empty envelope, say I deposited 100 and then immediately asked to withdraw 80, they're walking away with $80 when they put in an empty envelope. So bank went, oh my goodness, somebody would do this. And so then we had to put controls in place. So with the advent of any new products, services, and technologies, we need to familiarize ourselves with it. I think it's a very exciting area for persons in our field to explore.
That's right. And as of course you've said, it's no longer a sufficient excuse to say we bought the software. You have to adjust software for the risk appetite, as you called it previously, that a different institution may have. So using the same software, different institutions and their boards may have come up with a different appetite for risk and things, but it's no longer acceptable to say the computer said and it didn't pick it up or whatever. That's no longer an excuse. That's great, Glenn. I'm going to move to some of the questions. I'm going to encourage people to put things in. And although Mohammed was the first, I'm going to pick up a question from Vivian. And Vivian, first of all, Vivian, we don't want to know if this is a real situation or just one you've made up. If it's a real one, we certainly don't want to know the country and the name of the particular organisation. But Vivian says, how do you manage, you can all see it in the chat, how do you manage a situation in a customer who is implicated in financial crimes in their country, but legal dealings with our government? Now, of course, just to set the scene, one of the things we talk about there is we've talked about power between boards of directors, employees, the compliance function, but also in the example of continuous learning that we'll talk about right at the very end, which is a shameless plug for our own Chartered Banker MBA and Financial Crime and Compliance MBA, we talk about different national cultures have different views about power, and particularly either politicians or people who are connected closely to politicians may have power over other levels in that society, which prevents them from disclosing things. So the situation here is implicated in financial crimes and may have thought they've protected themselves by dealing with our government. Over 100 registered companies, all with accounts at a financial institution. We'll interpret that as being the same financial institution. And these companies engage in multi-million-dollar transactions, moving money between them, internal transfers. All these accounts have the same signatory. Wow. Even I'm thinking, well, there's a few things here we might want to have a look at. But any thoughts, not on a particular company or jurisdiction, Glenna? Going back to that one from Evelyn, which has just jumped, Vivian rather. Are there any bells that should ring alarms there?
Well,
Or
first off, I'll
at least
start
get
by
us to
saying,
ask questions.
yeah, I'll start off by saying nothing that I say today is meant to be construed as legal or regulatory advice directly. Just keep it as food for thought. So that is quite an interesting scenario that Vivian has brought to us. Of course, more details are needed. So financial crime implications, is there the concept, do we have to honor the concept of innocent until proven guilty? So how strong are those implications? Were there criminal convictions? Were there sanctions by a regulator for financial fraud? Or is it noise in the news because, some political party is, has a beef with some other persons or organizations? So then when we get down to things like this person having a number of registered companies, that means they may or may not have worked through a corporate and trust service provider. They're dealing with financial institutions because there's a mention here of all the accounts with a financial institution. Well, the onus is on the financial institution to do their due diligence. Did they want to onboard them? If they did onboard them, presumably they know this information, they've done their homework, they've done their internet searches, they've done their screening, hopefully using a commercially available database that's going to render a lot of information on access to adverse media and negative news, and are they sanctioned, and are they on a terrorist list, are they politically exposed persons, and made their risk-based decisions for whether to move forward with those relationships or not. Similarly, the government hopefully has their own due diligence for if they're onboarding a vendor, a third party in terms of managing third party risks. Hopefully they've done their own due diligence on the companies, on the individuals as well. So I can't really get into a lot more detail. This would be a full investigation that would be needed to be done, but certainly an interesting scenario. And dare I say it, that sometimes we do see things that appear to be in the public domain that leave us scratching our heads. And I only have to hope and believe that somebody has actually done a thorough amount of homework and made some determination and maybe even gotten a legal opinion for whether or not they can proceed with something.
Yes, and I think the other thing to say there is, without knowing the size of the institution, the size of the nation's financial ecosystem, you wouldn't want to have all your eggs as a company in one basket. You'd want, as a bank now, you'd want to diversify. If these all go belly up, then you're in deep stum. You talk about due diligence, and of course, due diligence has two forms: the initial due diligence and the ongoing due diligence, just to check, perhaps the annual investigation we're talking about that says, well, they were okay, but let's just see in the light of history whether they still are a customer we want. And of course, the problem for the bank is if you've got 100 registered companies there, all from the same corporate parent or something, if you start turning one or two away, they may decide to take them all away. And there comes that tension that we talked about right at the beginning of the discussion with Glenna, that says, wow, board of directors saying we don't want to lose this one who's got 100 companies and all the money we make from that. We won't talk about the challenge and the pain that auditors have when they get in similar situations. But this ongoing due diligence also applies to, they were okay when we looked at them in the context of regulation at that time. Regulations tightened up. How do they look now? Let me go to Mohammed's question. And Mohammed says, Glenna, your understanding, we see so many major banks not failing, but falling in default due to the regulators. Is this, so the question is, we see many major banks falling into default with compliance. And indeed, there are banks that shall not be named who have a couple of thousand, several thousand compliance officers globally who still are in the headlines. And I suppose it could be said, well, the more transactions, the more countries you're in, the greater is the chance that something will go wrong. But Mohammed goes on to say, is this due to the regulators not working with industry, or is it industry not updating fast enough to comply? Some people might suggest, and this is me commenting, some people might suggest it's not for the regulators to work that closely. The regulators regulate, and they take ideas from the 40 guidelines in FATF and try and include them in our national legislation. What about the question there, Glenna, that says, is it that industry is not updating fast enough? Is it the problem with the gamekeeper or with the poacher, as we may say?
Very interesting scenarios and questions, Stephen. And of course, we see many, many examples globally, not to name any particular institutions. And it is sometimes surprising, maybe disheartening, when we see so many violations and breakdowns in programs, some of them having let through a very serious volume of suspicious transactions and so on. And admittedly, when you're a very large financial institution, and Stephen, as you said, sometimes operating in various countries, yes, in name, they might be owned, by a legal entity at the top in another jurisdiction, but their respondent or subsidiaries in other countries might be run from, of course, a different management team that may or may not hold the same tone at the top as the board for the ultimate parent. So there's a number of complexities. Sometimes some of the businesses are set up for failure. For instance, I have seen some, not to name any names, where the ultimate corporate financial institution in their head office country has certain systems and processes set up. They have acquired banks in another country. They never actually invested to put them on the same systems. They cobbled together existing systems, tried to make the processes work, and quite frankly, those businesses were never set up for success. So, there's many possibilities. Is there adequate training? Were the systems set up properly to do what they are meant to do? Business has changed. Regulatory compliance requirements have changed. I find that a lot of large financial institutions, their systems are not up to par. And, so is it the regulation? Is it the regulator? Well, some of it, yes, is going to be slow adoption for regulations. Is the tone at the top? Is there an investment properly for having the adequate staff and resources on a compliance team? Do you have enough of your compliance team that is dedicated to what I call the core compliance activities? Or are you stealing all those resources to work just on your new business development growth projects, and you have them distracted with that, and they've lost sight necessarily of the core compliance activities because you haven't resourced those two areas enough, because you're putting them on the income generating activities and you're pulling them away from the fundamentals. So a lot of that is going to come from leadership, from management, from having a strong operational risk person, a strong compliance officer that's going to hold the line for that. And then regulators do have a role in this, but I'd say first, even before you get external to your four walls, what about your audit? Your audit team should be in there testing in a true independent nature and really kicking the tires and showing you where you're not up to speed with your regulatory requirements, and having a chance to fix that internally within your four walls before you're going to face a regulatory fine inspection. But again, are they not only resourced enough, are they allowed to have a voice and speak up and, share all the dirty laundry? Is there an executive in the financial institution that doesn't want to look bad and is trying to dampen down the results from an audit? versus all that information going to the board. So there's so many things that need to be explored. And then I dare say, and I'm just going to be very open and honest and frank about this, some of the penalties in some countries don't go far enough to really make it a deterrent. It's sort of like you've got this large international financial institution. They face a penalty of whatever the millions of dollars are. To them, all right, it's going to be hard this year, and next year we're back at it. Is it a deterrent? Are we doing the right thing? And I see a lot of interesting people who work in this space giving their voice on various platforms to say, when are we actually going to hold some of the persons, the key persons? Maybe it's the board of directors, maybe it's key persons in senior management. When are we going to hold more of them to account so that there is an impact, so that there is a motivation, so that there is a form of deterrence to get them to do the right thing?
Great. I myself will answer Mohammed's second question, where he says, what happens when there's compliance before the regulatory change and then regulatory change comes along and they're no longer compliant? Can industry and regulators work together? It is the case, I think, that, as I mentioned, the Financial Action Task Force does signal in advance, and so do many of the regulators. They consult in advance. So whilst they don't turn a blind eye for a certain period of time, there is the opportunity for organisations to become aware of what's coming down the pike, so to speak. Benjamin asks, in many instances, the first line of defence abdicate their responsibilities to the compliance team, a situation the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK has highlighted in one of its Dear CEO letters, saying to the leader, as we've been talking about it, the tone from the top, the first line of defence abdicate their responsibilities. What should organisations do to ensure there's ownership by the first line of defence, especially those in business development and customer facing roles? Thanks for that, Benjamin. To some extent, I think we have partly addressed that in talking about the tension that there will be between keep us compliant, go out after new business, etc. Any brief comment on Benjamin's question, Glenna?
Yeah, I think if I'm to address that quickly, there is more that can be done for the front line. Put in things like key performance indicators. So you've got your compliance department doing testing and monitoring. You have internal audit doing testing and monitoring. If there are, how do I say it, gaps, deficiencies that are identified in the front line, have it such that for the management team of the front line, those type of deficiencies show up in their scorecard, their report card. So it could have, and I've seen it at some financial institutions I worked at, that if those were found, it could affect that management team's performance reviews, which might affect their salary increase for the year, which might affect their bonuses. So
yeah, that's always one way of grabbing people's attention, isn't it? Just yeah. Babatunde says, in situations where there are ambiguous and grey areas interpreting and applying regulations that are unclear or open to multiple interpretations, how have you resolved those? And I think partly the answer might be, and then Glenna can say something, by advising in advance, by consulting, etc. Before introducing new things, there are opportunities to raise these issues. Of course, here we're talking largely about in financial institutions. There are countries that fall foul of the Financial Action Task Force and are classed as jurisdictions needing further enhanced monitoring, the so-called grey list and the blacklist. So countries as a whole can get onto these things. And the process that the Financial Action Task Force engages in, I understand for that, is one of these mutual assessments is carried out by a regional group, highlights areas which are needing further attention, etc. And then they engage in a dialogue with FATF. So any thoughts on that one?
Yeah,
the ambiguous and grey areas.
Comments to that. So first off, if there's an opportunity before the change rolls out, by all means, this is where everyone needs to use their voice, whether it's institutions individually or through an association at some point, to provide comments and helpful, workable, not just critical comments to the consultation paper, even If it looks like it's going to be too complex, invite them to a working meeting to get understanding from the industry. And that's something that I had to do years ago. I formed a committee in Canada. I was just part of it. And we actually got a group of banks together to the point that we then called a large information session with the legislatures, the Minister of Finance, the regulators, the Financial Intelligence Unit, whereby we actually had to educate and raise awareness for them. We understood why they wanted to make certain changes to the proceeds of crime legislation in Canada, but that operationally some of their requirements were just not workable. And as a matter of fact, they were going to miss the mark. And so we actually had to educate them to say, yes, we respect you need to make changes, but we're actually telling you to make it this way, because if not, you're going to miss this whole piece over here. So there is that type of opportunity. And yeah, I would probably leave it at that. But if after it's rolled out, interpretation can be difficult. And there are going to be times that the compliance department is going to have to either go to your internal legal department or to external counsel and obtain a legal opinion for what is their belief that and you would go to, of course, a regulatory legal expert and get their legal opinion for what they believe the interpretation is, and then follow your operational steps from that legal opinion. And that is something I've seen done many times in the industry.
Great, thanks for that, Glenna. Husi asks, are there some good sites to see usable operational risk information templates? I don't think we're able to provide those just in conversation, but perhaps we can just come up with a couple of names and their websites for that. And the major financial crime typologies that banks should look out for. I'm going to put an obvious plug in the MBA Financial Crime and Compliance modules. We talk about these things, and as a taster, rather than ask Glenna to speak about it now, I'll reproduce in the next day or so to the distribution list a couple of slides about the common typologies and the kind of things you could learn if you came on to study either for a qualification or indeed for training if you came to Bangor University's executive education. The final question I'm going to pick up is the common challenge of compliance is resourcing, humans and digital, and we've talked about that to some extent, and then fitting in the organisation. Part of it, the answer to this, we've addressed. Glenna says technology as a contribution for the foreseeable future, human oversight and interpretation and reducing the funnel of things that really need investigating. But at the end of it, a large part of it is from the top, the attitude and things sent from the top, the functional reporting to the board. Well, Glenna's talked about having an annual report to the board, possibly releasing that to the regulator with regard to the things that we're doing to demonstrate, even though occasionally there may be hiccups, we've at least got the correct intention. And the other thing that Glenna mentioned in the last few minutes was including parameters in the evaluation performance of everybody, including the managing director, would go a long way to do that because it grabs people's attention. So thanks for that one, Kevin. I think we've broadly covered that. And it remains for me now to thank Glenna for giving us a great insight to how compliance has evolved, why it's evolved, and the events. Continuous learning. I think we're saying when there's continuous change and new people come into an organisation and the corporate memory is lost when people move, let alone when there's changing regulations, you need learning of various kinds and the insight that blockchain may help us to do. So thanks for that, Glenna. Stay on the line. What I'm going to do is ask us to move on to the next slide, which was the Q&A. I think it's titled. Are we able to do that, Sinead? And
I wouldn't mind adding, Stephen, if I can, is,
yeah,
we talk about this continuous learning, right? And much of it, I'm going to actually put the ball back in your court for all the participants here. It's up to you to go and find it, obtain it, seek it out. Some of it will have to be paid for. Plenty of it is free. Start a group, start an association, attend a seminar, look for free webinars. There are courses online, there are certifications. Some are worth investing in and paying for. Look for focused training. Look at content creators on platforms like LinkedIn that are discussing a lot of the challenges and cases and so on. There's videos on YouTube to learn about cryptocurrency and blockchain. But I really dare you to think about, even, never mind if your current employer is not willing to pay for you to take a course or a certification, it's something that's going to follow you. It becomes part of your toolkit. It becomes a resource for you. It becomes an item on your resume that is going to follow you no matter where you work and take with you. So isn't it worth investing in yourself?
Absolutely. And the screenshot, as I can see it now, is one form that you can gain an integrated view. As Glenna says, there are some that are paid for. There are some that are just a form of training without application. There are others which are watching YouTube. They all have a role to play. But if your organization wants you to study a coherent set of across the piece, and also to be required to demonstrate application, our two programs here stand ready to help you to do that. The Chartered Banker MBA and the Financial Crime and Compliance MBA. They are both globally unique. They're the only ones from a traditional university in the UK that is research based and which carries with it a professional designation. Chartered Banker MBA carries with it the Chartered Banker designation, professional designation from the Chartered Banker Institute in Scotland, and the Financial Crime and Compliance carries with it the Financial Intelligence Specialist Award. In parallel. You can take these as individual modules, but you don't have to complete the assessment if you don't want to. I'd be lying if I didn't say that these are paid for, but there are full programs. You may get exemptions depending on what you've studied before and your experience, and you can take some of these just for training and in short course mode. On the final slide, it talks about where you can find more information, and for our autumn intake for October 2024, there are some funded scholarships available for the full program, and the word full program allows me to say in the full program there are more modules than in the accelerated program. The accelerated program is accessed by virtue of things you've studied before that give you exemptions. The best way to find out where you stand is to get in touch with the email address there, and you can find more about it on that web link, bangor.ac.uk/executive-education. Glenna, it's been great talking with you, and a wide-ranging coverage of a wide-ranging topic, and lots of optimistic things that people can do even if they don't have funding from their organisation. And just to share with you that some organisations say you take the first step and commit to studying a module. Once we've seen that you're willing to put time and effort into it, continuing to work, study as well, the tensions that creates, then we may reimburse you, we may pay for future modules. All sorts of comments by way of goodbye, saying thanks, excellent session, loved the session, etc. Thank you so much, Glenna. Speak to you again soon. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, Stephen. I want to thank you for the opportunity. I'm a big believer in continuous education. So get out there, explore the opportunities that Stephen mentioned, seek out those yourself. And I believe in continuous learning journey. I've been at this for 35, 36 years. Every year, I'm pressing myself to learn something new and stay up to date.
Right, it's not a competition. It's not a competition, but I've been doing it for 1 or 2 years longer, but that's by the by. Okay, everybody. Bye-bye. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks
Bye,
so much.
Glenna.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.